A film critic called Clint Eastwood an embarrassment to cinema in a major newspaper. The Academy gave Clint the Best Director Oscar that same year. Clint's response became the most savage revenge in Hollywood history. It was March 1993, and Clint Eastwood had just won the Academy Award for Best Director for Unforgiven. He was standing on stage at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion holding the Oscar, giving his characteristically brief acceptance speech when he made an unexpected addition at the very end that would shock the industry. "There's someone I need to thank," Clint said, his voice carrying that familiar rasp. "Someone who inspired me this year in a very particular way." The audience waited, curious. Clint rarely singled people out in speeches. "Peter Hammond," Clint continued, and the name sent a ripple through the crowd. "Film critic for the Chicago Herald. Peter wrote something about me last year that I've been thinking about a lot. He called my work an embarrassment to cinema and said I had no business directing films. Peter, if you're watching, and I'm pretty sure you are, this Oscar is for you." Clint held up the golden statue, his slight smile visible to millions watching worldwide. "Thank you for the motivation." The audience erupted in applause and laughter. They knew exactly what Clint was doing. And so did Peter Hammond, watching from his living room in Chicago, his face going white as he realized what had just happened. 6 months earlier, Peter Hammond had been one of the most respected and influential film critics in America. His reviews in the Chicago Herald were widely read, his opinions carried weight, and his praise or condemnation could significantly impact a film's reception. He'd been reviewing films for 30 years and had built a reputation as a serious critic who wasn't afraid to challenge popular opinion. In September 1992, Hammond had written a review of Unforgiven that would destroy his career. The headline was already inflammatory: Eastwood's latest, an embarrassment to cinema. But the actual review was even more brutal, more personal, more career-defining than anyone expected. "Clint Eastwood has made a career of playing the same character in increasingly worse films," Hammond wrote in the opening paragraph. His latest attempt at serious filmmaking, Unforgiven, is perhaps his most pretentious work yet. Eastwood's direction is plodding and obvious, lacking any sense of visual sophistication or narrative complexity. His performance is wooden and one-note, the same squint and whisper he's been recycling for 3 decades. His vision of the American West is derivative and shallow, borrowing from better filmmakers without understanding what made their work meaningful. The review continued for another 1,000 words, each paragraph more scathing than the last. Hammond called the film's violence gratuitous and juvenile, mistaking bloodshed for depth. He described the moral complexity as confused and muddled, the work of a director who thinks ambiguity equals profundity. He dismissed Gene Hackman's performance as wasted talent in service of a director who has no idea what to do with good actors. He even attacked the cinematography, the editing, and the score. Nothing about the film escaped his contempt, but it was the final paragraph that would haunt Hammond forever. "The question isn't whether Clint Eastwood can make a good film. That ship has sailed. The question is why the industry continues to give him opportunities to inflict his limited talents on audiences. Eastwood is an embarrassment to cinema, a relic of a simpler time when competence was mistaken for artistry. He has no business directing films, and Unforgiven is painful proof of his fundamental lack of understanding about what cinema can and should be." When the review was published, it caused immediate controversy. Some critics agreed with Hammond, praising his courage in challenging Eastwood's reputation. Others thought Hammond had gone too far, that the personal nature of the attacks crossed a line, but Hammond defended his review in subsequent columns. "Critics have a responsibility to tell the truth, even when that truth is unpopular," he wrote. "Clint Eastwood has been coasting on charm and squinting for decades. Someone needed to say it." Then the other reviews started coming in. Roger Ebert gave Unforgiven 4 stars, calling it a film of great beauty and grace. The New York Times called it one of the finest westerns ever made. Variety praised Clint's direction as masterful and subtle. Review after review contradicted Hammond's assessment, but Hammond doubled down. He wrote a follow-up column titled "Why Everyone is Wrong About Unforgiven," arguing that critics were being blinded by nostalgia and Eastwood's star power. "The Emperor has no clothes," Hammond insisted, "and I'm apparently the only critic brave enough to say it." The box office told a different story. Unforgiven was a massive hit, eventually grossing $159 million worldwide. Audiences loved exactly what Hammond had hated: the moral complexity, the unglamorous violence, the lack of easy answers. In December 1992, the Oscar buzz began. Unforgiven was showing up on every critic's year-end best list, except Hammond's. He wrote a column expressing dismay that the Academy was even considering the film for nominations. If Unforgiven receives major Oscar nominations, it will confirm that the Academy has lost touch with what constitutes genuine cinematic achievement, Hammond wrote. This is political correctness run amok, praising Eastwood because he's an elder statesman, not because he's made a good film. When the Oscar nominations were announced in February 1993, Unforgiven received 9 nominations, including Best Picture and Best Director. Hammond wrote another column, this one titled "The Academy's Embarrassing Error." That the Academy has nominated 9 times a film this mediocre speaks volumes about the current state of American cinema. Hammond wrote, "Clint Eastwood's direction deserves no recognition whatsoever. The nomination itself is an embarrassment." Industry insiders were starting to turn against Hammond. His criticisms had gone beyond professional disagreement into personal vendetta territory. Other critics began distancing themselves from his views. Even the Chicago Herald's editors were receiving complaints. But Hammond was committed. He'd staked his reputation on being right about Unforgiven. If he backed down now, he'd look foolish. So he kept pushing. In the weeks leading up to the Oscars, Hammond wrote multiple columns predicting that Unforgiven would lose every major category. He analyzed why the Academy would come to their senses and recognize that the nominations were a mistake. He wrote an entire essay about why Clint Eastwood specifically couldn't win Best Director. Eastwood's direction is technically competent at best, Hammond wrote in his final pre-Oscar column. The Academy has never rewarded mediocrity with this award, and they won't start now. Eastwood will lose Best Director, and it will be a relief to everyone who actually understands cinema. Then came Oscar night, March 29, 1993, the ceremony that would change everything. Gene Hackman won Best Supporting Actor for Unforgiven. Hammond, watching from his living room in Chicago, assured himself this was a fluke. Hackman was a great actor who'd elevated bad material. One win didn't mean anything. Joel Cox won Best Film Editing for Unforgiven. Hammond frowned, but told himself technical awards didn't mean much. They were given out early for a reason. They weren't the important ones. Then they announced Best Director. The moment Hammond had been dreading but also denying could happen. And the Oscar goes to Clint Eastwood, Unforgiven. Hammond sat frozen in his living room as Clint walked to the stage, accepted the Oscar, and gave his speech. The speech that ended with Clint thanking Hammond by name for calling him an embarrassment to cinema. Hammond's phone started ringing immediately with urgent calls, colleagues calling in shock, other critics wanting reactions, his editor demanding immediate explanation. All of them had watched Clint Eastwood publicly humiliate Peter Hammond in front of 1 billion people worldwide. But Clint wasn't done. 10 minutes later, Unforgiven won Best Picture. Clint's second Oscar of the night. In his acceptance speech for that award, he said, "This one's for everyone who was told they weren't good enough, weren't talented enough, weren't worthy enough." Sometimes the best response to criticism is to prove the critics wrong. The entire industry knew he was talking about Hammond. The next morning, Hammond woke up to find himself a national joke. Talk shows were playing clips of Clint's speech and laughing about the critic who'd called the Best Picture and Best Director winner an embarrassment to cinema. Entertainment journalists were writing articles about Hammond's spectacular misjudgment, but the real damage came from something else. 3 days after the Oscars, Hammond received a package at the Chicago Herald offices. Inside was a professional photograph, an 8 by 10 glossy print showing Clint Eastwood holding both his Oscars, one in each hand, with that slight smile on his face. The smile that said everything without saying anything. The smile of someone who'd been told he was an embarrassment and had just proved otherwise in the most public way possible. At the bottom of the photo, Clint had written in silver marker, "For Peter, thanks for the motivation, still embarrassing cinema. Clint Eastwood." The inscription was perfect, not angry, not bitter, just acknowledging Hammond's words while holding 2 Academy Awards that proved those words catastrophically wrong. And Clint had sent copies of that signed photo to every major film critic in America, over 200 copies, and to every major entertainment publication, and posted a framed version in the lobby of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences building, where industry professionals would see it daily. The message was clear. Clint Eastwood had won. Peter Hammond had lost, and everyone in Hollywood would know it. The photo became legendary almost immediately. It was printed in Variety with the caption, "Eastwood's response to his harshest critic." Entertainment Weekly ran it with the headline, "The Sweetest Revenge, How Clint Embarrassed His Critic." The Hollywood Reporter called it the most savage response to negative criticism in Oscar history. Hammond tried to save face. He wrote a column titled, "Why 2 Oscars Don't Make a Good Film," arguing that Academy Awards didn't determine quality and that his assessment of Unforgiven remained valid despite the honors. Nobody cared. Hammond had been publicly humiliated by Clint Eastwood in the most devastating way possible, not with anger or insults, but with success and a slight smile. The damage to Hammond's reputation was immediate, devastating, and permanent. His authority as a critic evaporated overnight. How could readers trust the judgment of someone who'd called the Best Picture winner an embarrassment? How could his opinions carry weight when he'd been so spectacularly, publicly wrong? Other critics started referencing pulling a Hammond when someone spectacularly misjudged a film. It became industry shorthand for critical failure. His colleagues at other publications began distancing themselves from him. Critics who'd initially defended his right to negative opinions now quietly admitted he'd gone too far. Film festivals stopped inviting him to panels. Studios stopped sending him advance screenings. His professional network, built over 30 years, collapsed in weeks. The Chicago Herald, deeply embarrassed by the association with such a public humiliation, quietly moved Hammond to a less prominent position within 6 months. His column went from the main arts section to a back page few people read. His reviews were no longer featured or promoted. His influence, once considerable, vanished completely. Readers who used to seek out his opinions now avoided them, knowing he'd been exposed as someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted. By 1995, Hammond had left the Chicago Herald entirely. He tried freelancing for smaller publications, but his name had become synonymous with bad judgment. Editors didn't want the critic who'd been humiliated by Clint Eastwood. Hammond attempted a comeback in 2000 with a book titled Against the Current, Why Popular Opinion is Usually Wrong About Movies. The book sold fewer than 5,000 copies. Critics reviewing it couldn't resist mentioning his Unforgiven disaster. Meanwhile, Clint's career continued to soar. He directed and produced dozens more acclaimed films. He won another Best Director Oscar for $1 Million Baby in 2005. That signed photo of him holding his 2 Unforgiven Oscars became one of the most famous images in Academy Awards history. Film schools started using Hammond's review as an example of how critics can be spectacularly wrong. The review was taught alongside other legendary critical misjudgments, like the initial dismissals of Citizen Kane and The Wizard of Oz. In 2012, during an interview about his career, Clint was asked about the Hammond incident. His response was brief but telling. Critics have jobs to do. They should do them honestly. But when someone crosses from criticism into personal attack, when they say someone has no business doing what they love, sometimes you have to respond. I let the work speak first. Then I let the Oscars speak. Then I sent the photo. That said everything that needed to be said. The interviewer pressed, "Did you feel vindicated?" Clint smiled that slight smile. I felt motivated. Peter Hammond told me I was an embarrassment. That made me work harder to prove him wrong. In a way, he did motivate me. Just not the way he intended. Hammond, by then mostly forgotten, watched that interview from his apartment. He'd spent 20 years being remembered not for his long career, not for his other reviews, but for being spectacularly wrong about one film and then being publicly humiliated by its director at the Oscars. Today, Unforgiven is considered one of the greatest westerns ever made and one of Clint Eastwood's finest achievements. Hammond's review, calling it an embarrassment to cinema, is remembered only as one of history's worst critical misjudgments. The signed photo of Clint holding his 2 Oscars still hangs in the Academy building. Below it, a small plaque reads, "To Peter Hammond, thanks for the motivation." The lesson for critics was clear. Challenge films, question choices, disagree with popular opinion, but think carefully before you declare that someone has no business doing what they do. Because sometimes they'll prove you wrong in the most public, devastating, permanent way possible. And sometimes they'll sign a photo to commemorate your humiliation and send copies to everyone in your industry. If this story of perfect vindication moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to remember that the best response to people who say you can't do something is to do it so well that they look foolish for ever doubting you.